experience working with diverse communities to promote social justice and civic action through positions such as with Columbus Parks and Recreation and Parks, that's important, the order there, the Martin Luther King Jr. Art Complex, and the Ohio State University. Jen earned her master's in art policy, education, and administration at the John Glenn School of Public Affairs at Ohio State. She's also a board member of the Ohio Debate Commission, the Ohio History Connection, and Kids Voting Ohio. One of Jen's main goals is to inspire others to participate in civic engagement. She is a jazz singer and the proud mother of one daughter. So please welcome Jen. We're looking forward to her update on League of Women Voters in Ohio. One more thing, please remember to mute your phones.
Hey everybody. So one thing that I have been forgetting to put in my bio, but I think it's important because you will be interested, is I'm also on the commission to get a monument on the Ohio State House grounds that honors suffragists. And because here's the thing on the State House grounds, there's actually not one monument that depicts real women. There's one woman, if you remember the angel, some mythical angelic creature, but all the other monuments, if there are people, they're of men. And so think about all the fourth graders that tour the State House and think that history is made by men and men alone. And so representation matters. You'll hear more about that because we're in the fundraising stage. So I want to thank all of you, and especially Metro League, and especially Elizabeth. You know, this time of year, every election year, y'all make me look so good. I get compliments all the time on stuff that I have nothing to do with, but they think so, right? Because they're like, your candidate forum was amazing. Oh, your registration volunteers are out of sight. And that's you guys. And I just have to say, and you know I only say this here, and you're not supposed to tell anyone, but you are my favorite league, because you are my league. Since I am living in Columbus too. So thank you for all of that. Seriously, what you do is so critical, right? Voting is the foundation of all rights, and you you know, all the work you do on the ground is just utterly critical. I'm going to give you a little redistricting update. Guess what? We don't have the best maps. Surprise! But you knew that. Okay, so this is what's happening. I think if you've all been watching, and it's okay if you've lost count, but many, many times maps have been adopted and the Supreme Court has struck them down as unconstitutional. There's good news. The good news is that the initial maps that were created by the Redistricting Commission are far worse than the ones that voters are voting on. The bad news is that they're still gerrymandered. So here's the three things that we're doing. We're doing short, medium, and long term. The short term is that we need to make sure exactly what you're doing. You're helping people find their districts, that you're helping them understand how important it is to vote on every candidate on the ballot, from judge, thinking about the jobs that folks like this, that the Secretary of State or the Supreme Court Justice does, local judge. Make sure folks are voting on that. Keep in mind that there are actually a lot more swingable districts now than there were before. And so we need to make sure that voters are showing up and voting their preference, because that will tell us actually a lot more about the maps. The medium term is that we still have lawsuits going. So we still have a lawsuit open before the Ohio Supreme Court for the State House legislative districts, as well as our congressional delegation. Those obviously are not going to change before November. So that's why really looking and seeing who those redistricting commissioners are going to be matters, who those Supreme Court justices matters. And we will continue to work on that. The bottom line is that the case really speaks for itself. The evidence is there that these are gerrymandered and unfair maps. I want us all to be careful how we talk about that before the election, because one of the things we don't want to do is, yes, we need to educate voters about gerrymandering and keep doing that, But no, we don't want people to feel like that means their vote just doesn't matter. And so we have to walk this really funky line. And if anyone can do it, it's us, right? And then the long term is we're going to have to reform the Constitution again. This is going to take a long time. I know we're all mad and we want to get out our clipboards right now, but we have to get a lot of ducks in a row to really do this. And one of the reasons is because, we're researching all the different states, and there's something that's very interesting, is that a lot of states that have better districts than we do, that are actually turning the tide and ending the worst form of gerrymandering, they have similar rules to ours. They have some sort of anti-gerrymandering provision in their constitution too. They have, or in their state laws, they have some sort of, just protections to keep communities together and things like that. But the difference is it's not politicians. It's not elected officials. And our dear friend Catherine Churcher says, when someone's drunk on alcohol, you take away the keys. These mappers are drunk on power. We need to take away their keys, or I would say, take away the pen from them. It's gonna mean we have to fundraise a lot more. We need to do a lot more research in terms of the policies as well as public polling. And so we'll get back at it. We also want to watch those federal Supreme Court races to see what they do. Because I don't want us getting, maybe we've already got 100,000 ballot signatures, something comes down from the Supreme Court and we realize that what we're doing won't fly, won't pass muster anymore. So that's where we are on that. In terms of elections, please keep doing what you're doing in terms of registration and educating voters. Keep in mind that election protection is absolutely critical, and it's critical to us specifically. We use all those calls that go into that election protection hotline to tell us how voters are doing, to tell us if there are themes in terms of misunderstandings that poll workers are having where we need to improve training, to tell us if there's something we need to do differently in policy, either through the Secretary of State's office or the legislature. It also has been the proof that we've needed to litigate. So in 2004, the evidence we got through election protection, in fact, I was an election protection poll monitor back then, I wasn't even in democracy issues, and the location I was at became the subject of a league lawsuit that secured better disability access, election administration plans, so pre-planning, post-election audits. So we need to do that. I also like to ask you all to be kind to our elections officials, because they are, and our poll workers, because they are the brunt of a lot of nasty rhetoric right now. And they are the backbone of how our elections work. If you want to write a letter to the editor kind of explaining how our system is secure and bipartisan and all those things, we're trying to fill the airwaves as much as possible before Election Day with good information, given that there's so mis and disinformation out there so much. And finally, we do need some call center volunteers, and I know you all do, and I'm so proud of what you do on Election Day with Channel 10, but all the way through early voting, we need volunteers that are actually answering those lines. And the entire coalition, which is like 12 organizations, has all acknowledged that league members are some of the best for this because we know so much about elections. All of you know so much about elections, so please consider helping us with that. Finally, real quick, after the election, we're going to have lame duck. And I really hate that term. I think you've probably heard me say I want to have a naming contest because there's nothing lame about this duck. It's like all kinds of all kinds of legislation flying at us, right? Because we have a year-round legislature that introduces all these kinds of laws, thousands of pieces of legislation, a lot of it terrible, some of it good, and any of it is in the hopper and could be passed. So there includes legislation that could reduce early voting as little as 7 days. There's, in that same piece of legislation, it would change absentee voting so that you would have to have an excuse, or at least claim an excuse. That same piece of legislation would say that you have to have an Ohio ID, and it's not just good enough if it's an Ohio ID that's unexpired. It's got to be an Ohio ID that's unexpired that has your exact address on there. So anyone who's moved since they've had gotten their driver's license or state ID would have to bring another piece of verification. They would have to prove their address. So that's just one of many. I don't know that one will pass, but I wanted you to know what could pass. And that's why this year we're having our State House Day on December 7th instead. So please mark your calendars. We will have the registration out soon. But we're going to train you on what we are most worried about in terms of policies. We're going to set you loose to educate your lawmakers and other lawmakers on what it is we would like to see. And also, please, 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 I want to make sure we have as many young people as possible in the room. So we will work to have scholarships again. And, you know, if we get a lot from Central Ohio, I might actually ask the Metro League to help us with those scholarships. But that would be a great problem to have, to run out of scholarships. You know, I got the democracy bug as a student who figured out that democracy was a participatory sport through a lobby day. It was actually going and talking about the arts and why the arts mattered to me and why arts education mattered to me as a student. And ever since then, I've never gotten enough, obviously. And so this is our chance. Just like we promote youth at the booth to our young ones, let's bring our young ones to State House Day. And with that, I just want to say, I also applaud you all for having this kind of continued focus on journalism. I really see journalists as partners with us in educating voters. And so I'm really excited about this program. I'm so honored to always be with each of you, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jen. So glad to have her with us. She does such important work at the State House for us. I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker right now, Dr. Edith Dassel. She started her career as a broadcast journalist, worked as a broadcast journalist for 7 years, and now she's been with Ohio University Scripps School of Journalism for 30 years. During her 30 years with OU, she was also the Associate Dean for Graduate Programs in the Scripps College of Communication. She was the Assistant Provost for Multicultural Graduate Affairs in the OU Office of Graduate Studies. And she was the Assistant Dean for Undergraduate Studies in the Scripps College of Communications. Now she's the Director of the Scripps Schools of Journalism. Her first love, however, is teaching and mentoring her students. She has received numerous awards, including Athens County Outstanding Woman of the Year in 2005, the OU Professor Award, which is a student-based teaching award, the Horton Faculty Mentor Award, and the OU Chapman Clapp Outstanding Advisor Award. We're so pleased to welcome Dr. Edith Dassel, and when she concludes her remarks, we'll bring up Ann Fisher from WSU's All Sides with Ann Fisher, and we'll continue the discussion, including questions and discussion from the audience. So help me welcome Dr. Dassel. And thank you, Dr. Dassel, for driving all the way from Athens to get here today.
Thank you. Happy Wednesday. It's good to see you, and I'm honored to have been invited by Elizabeth. Thank you, Elizabeth, to come and speak with you tonight. I think this is my first public appearance since the pandemic. So, but I do bring you greetings from the EW Scripps School of Journalism at Ohio University. And yes, this is my 30th year at OU. 3 years away from retirement. And yes, I spell my first name with 2 E's. I'm named after my grandmother. And My grandmother was named after another relative who was probably a slave and didn't know how to read and write and therefore did the best they could with spelling names. And so when someone always asks me, how come you can't even spell your own name? I got that during my journalism interview, my interview with the school. My response was that second D represents the sacrifices my ancestors made so that I could one day teach at a predominantly white institution and get to hang out with y'all. I was hired to teach broadcast journalism, so the first few years I taught, TV news. We still have, but I was responsible for teaching a collection of courses where students would produce their own newscast, their own local newscast. It aired on the local community TV channel, so anyone who had a television could tune in at 6:30 Monday through Friday and watch the students share the news. And there was opportunity for them, whatever mistakes they could make, it was live. And to work out and to practice so they wouldn't be, they could be better prepared when they went out to start their own broadcast journalism careers. But I always had a phrase I would say during class. I'd always say, don't let the technology dictate the content. Now this was 1992. This was before the email and the internet became commonplace in the School of Journalism. In fact, in one of our faculty minutes I was looking back on last summer, I had to chuckle because in the section called Miscellaneous, it was written that the faculty decided they would consider whether they should have their own email accounts. Miscellaneous. Could consider. And so when I would teach my journalism classes, at that time, the technology consisted of satellite trucks. That was the newest technology at that time. And I worked at a television station in Nashville. If you can't tell from my accent, I'm from Tennessee. And I would hear conversations where the accounting office would be upset because these satellite trucks were so expensive. And the news department had to demonstrate that they were getting their money's worth. And so what they would do is they would have reporters do live shots from an empty parking lot, or places where there wasn't really anything going on anymore, just so they could show the business department that yes, we are using this expensive piece of equipment. And so I would say, don't let the technology dictate the content. Don't just do a live shot because you have to prove to someone why you bought. You were allowed to purchase it. That you had to have something to say. But over the years, it has gotten more and more difficult. Today I find in teaching, in administration, and in journalism, the technology is indeed dictating the content. I'll have conversations with students, and the first thing out of their mouth is Instagram, or Twitter, or, Facebook is just for old folks. Without ever getting to the content of what they're looking for. And so that's my long-winded way of saying I'm rebelling tonight against technology. You won't see any PowerPoint slides, I'm not going to show a YouTube video, it's just me. The kid is 1986. And I have to, bring a point, make my points without any extra technology. And because I'm concerned about technology, it's still the same presentation, local journalism and democracy, but I tweaked it a little and add some other things. The First Amendment local journalism and democracy in the digital age. You all know about the U.S. Constitution. It's been around a long time, about 231 years. And you know that the Constitution has a set of Bill of Rights, and the First Amendment guarantees 5 different rights. Among them, freedom of speech and freedom of the press. On the first day when I teach the communication law class, I want to remind students that the First Amendment, well, a couple of things. In case they're on a game show, the First Amendment isn't the First Amendment because the Founding Fathers thought it was the most important right. That if all the proposed amendments had been ratified, it would have been the Third Amendment. There were 2 others ahead of it. They didn't get ratified, so by default, it became the First Amendment. And that the First Amendment wasn't written just for journalists. It was written for everybody. And so when you criticize journalists and you want to control how they report, what they say, those same arguments could be used to silence them. And the third point I always would make is that the First Amendment is only 45 words on some faded parchment that has stored permanent home in the rotunda for the Charters of Freedom, which is on the upper level of the National Archives Museum, along with the other 9 amendments to the Bill of Rights, the original Declaration of Independence, and the original Constitution of the United States. But I tell them they're just words. They're only words. And the only way for us to maintain our free speech rights and journalists' freedom to publish is for us to respect the limitations, our responsibilities under the First Amendment, but to be willing to support that, because those freedoms outlined in the First Amendment, particularly free press, is the foundation, of our democracy. In order to preserve our democracy, we have to be able to have access to information, accurate as possible information, so we can make informed decisions about who we're going to vote for. And the individuals who are our watchdog, our liaison between us and government, whether the government happens to be the city council, county commission, state legislature, governor, president of the United States, there has to be that watchdog. And so the journalists they have that watchdog function to bring transparency to government, because there are a lot of things that journalists will see or they have access to that voters won't. And so one of the questions I was assigned to answer, I had received my assignment, I understood the assignment. Why is local journalism important to democracy? Well, local journalists, they're the heart of our communities. If we want to find out what's happening locally, whether it's corruption that we're talking about at the table there, or testing a elected official's fitness for office, or even monitoring storms like Hurricane Ian, that comes from our local journalists. We can't get that type of information at a local level in our communities without local journalism. So journalists in the local communities, they make sure that we get the news we need at our fingertips, and whether it's good old-fashioned print, or watching it on over-the-air signals on television, or going to our social media accounts to find it. And if we don't have a strong and independent local journalists in the communities, there wouldn't be anyone there to shine that spotlight on what our local government is doing. Other important issues to us like healthcare, education, the environment. As a result of that, if there's not steady coverage of those issues, local communities see less accountability because the stories aren't coming out, so the elected officials aren't being held accountable, there's no transparency, the public is less informed. When the public's less informed, it's been shown that that leads to a decrease in voter turnout and civic engagement. It even can lead to higher crime in communities, and so the local journalists serve an important role in their communities. Then, of course, my next assignment was to explain what are the current threats to journalism. Well, local journalism, even though it's necessary for maintaining an informed and active citizenry, is under threat. I outlined 3 threats that I think are important that affect local journalism remaining strong and independent. One is simply economics, money. It's expensive to produce news. Local radio and TV stations are at the heart of our communities, but it's expensive to produce radio and television news. The National Association of Broadcasters, they report that the cost of local news on TV and radio stations, sometimes they may spend a quarter of their total budgets on news costs. And broadcasters, they have to rely entirely on advertising revenues to support local media. Radio stations, their content, 70.4% of radio stations run local newscasts. I remember when I worked at a little radio station in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, my first job out of school. One of the things I had to read was the Daily Hog Report. And I was always amazed at the number of people who actually listened to the Hog Report. I didn't know anything about livestock, but I read it to the best of my ability, and people were listening because they were raising livestock in order to feed their families. And that more than 76% of local radio stations operate, they have their own separate newsroom. And that radio stations provide an average of 92 minutes of local news per day. But that's expensive. It's an expensive endeavor. What I find concerning is that with economics and with the expenses associated with producing local news, when a local radio station or television station or even newspaper, when they're sold, the people who purchase these news organizations, it is a business venture for them. They have no journalism training, they have no journalism background. They probably may have thought about the First Amendment, but they weren't really engaged in protecting the First Amendment. And so when local news becomes a business and they're looking at, we need to make money, and they're focusing more on the revenue generation than they are on the content, then that hurts local news. So the economics. I've heard stories here in Columbus Dispatch, owned by Gannett. I hear stories every now and then about layoffs. Gannett's a company located somewhere else. They own number of news organizations, but when it got too expensive, the first thing they would do, among the first things they would do, is lay off employees. And those employees were the ones who were covering local news. Community newspapers used to be family-owned, a lot of them were, and then when the families sold those newspapers, they would be sold to a conglomerate for a business that had no roots in the community. They may live someplace else, in a different state. They're operating it like a business, but because they don't have any roots in the community, there's no real commitment to making sure local news is being covered. So stations who are committed to journalism, they have to also be committed to accepting that it's an expensive endeavor to do in the name of serving the local communities. And if you haven't already guessed, the the major threat I find to journalism, local journalism, is technology. Big tech, I think, is a threat to local journalism. The overwhelming power of big tech, they act as gatekeepers to information that we receive, and it's threatening Americans' access to quality local news. The size of the platforms, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and I don't even know if Snapchat's still in business now, because they change so rapidly. But those major big tech companies, they dwarf local news organizations. And so when you see local news on your Facebook, you're hanging out and you have your smartphone in front of you and you're reading what's going on locally. And you think it's really great because you can find it on your various social media accounts. That is good because now there's a broader audience to get the local news that you cover, that you feel like that you need to keep up with. However, big tech is making money off the backs of local journalists through their advertising and sponsoring content. And because they're such huge, big businesses, they can dictate what you see and how the creators of the content are compensated. Big tech's advantage, they're able to capitalize on local news and divert the revenue dollars into their own coffers. The business practices of the tech giants prevent local stations from recouping their investment in local journalism. News is expensive. They sell advertising in order to pay for the local news coverage. However, the big tech companies are taking a big share of that. These platforms exert enormous influence over what online content is eligible to be monetized. If it's something that can be sold, you get a lot of likes, a lot of hits, then that's what you're going to see and read about. If you can't make money off of it, the big tech companies aren't particularly interested in sharing that information through their platforms. So that means there are a lot of stories that maybe are important to communities, but you're not going to find it on social media. And then, ironically, it's the local media that bear the cost of producing the quality journalism that benefits the big tech platforms. Takes dollars away from local stations that could reinvest that money into serving the community. Instead, it goes to the tech giants. For example, local broadcasters see at best a little more than half of the revenue from video ads on YouTube. Facebook reportedly offers the same revenue share for in-stream ads. There's a 2021 report by the BIA Advisory Services, and it focused on Google searches and Facebook news feeds. And this organization found that local broadcasters lose an estimated $1.873 billion annually by providing their content to the big tech companies. But because of the size and power of big tech, their policies are always usually, well, take it or leave it. You don't have to put our content on our platforms if you don't want to. And even though the local stations are working at a disadvantage, there's little power to negotiate with the tech giants. Broadcasters would lose access to the hundreds of millions of consumers if they simply decline to publish their content on these platforms. And not only do these tech giants pose major threats to advertising revenue, but again, they're the gatekeepers of online content, exerting power over what internet users access and how advertisers reach them. What you see online is big tech's call, not ours. Local broadcast news and information, yes, it's available anywhere and everywhere for audience to see, on air, on websites, social media, various other apps. But the tech giants exert enormous influence over what content you see on their platforms through their algorithms. And I'm sure you've heard stories about their algorithms, especially Facebook, that they can adjust their algorithms to favor certain news content over others on their platforms. There's a reason why you get certain pop-ups on your social media. If you click on, I don't know, one time I clicked on an article about cats, or my friend posted a photo about cats. Next thing I knew, I had all kind of advertising for cat food, and I go, well, I don't have a cat. So that kind of thing. And sometimes these tech giants can steer you toward controversial content rather than high quality journalism in order to improve the number of likes and hits that they get, because people are going to go for the sensational. They go for emotion. And these tech giants are gatekeepers. They can control exactly what information we see, news information on social media. So what can we do to help strengthen and support quality local journalism? Well, as everyone's been talking about tonight, lobby your elected public officials. Many members of Congress are already working on solutions that will allow broadcasters and other news publishers to negotiate with big tech about how their content can be shared online. So while you're lobbying your legislators, you'll tell how much you value your local stations and ask them to stand up for listeners and viewers like you. That reminds me of being on public radio. By supporting. So there's currently the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. It's House Bill 1730 and Senate Bill 673. And the goal of this proposed law, federal law, is to ensure local news publishers receive fair compensation from companies like Google and Facebook for use of their original content. By not paying small and local publishers for access to their quality reporting, big tech has created news deserts, driving many outlets out of business. So the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act would allow small and local news publishers to collectively negotiate with the big tech companies for fair compensation so they get paid fairly when these big tech companies use their original quality journalism on their sites. Another thing I think is important is to realize that it's not only the journalist's problem to solve. I'll listen to students talk, or my friends who are not in the School of Journalism talk, and they seem to think that they don't have anything to worry about in terms of the First Amendment or information that they find to be fake, misinformation. And so I think it's important for all of us to be well versed in media literacy, because another threat is distrust. The distrust people have for journalists today, and that's fostered, I think, because many people don't understand that the internet is not automatically journalism. No, the internet was created for a completely different purpose. I think those who developed the internet back in the late 50s, early 60s, when it was only being used by researchers and the military, never conceived that one day it would be part of popular culture, like it is today. And so for that reason, just because you see it on the internet doesn't mean it's true. And just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it was posted by a journalist a journalist who prides themselves on having accurate, quality journalism. And with today's technology, anybody can create anything. And so media literacy is important. A couple of examples I have that I use in class is that you notice I talk with my hands. I'm gesturing all the time. And so a photographer, if they have a fancy gadget where they can take quick frames over and over again, if they take enough photographs of me, at some point I might do this. But I'm talking about some completely different topic. Next thing you know, they have my photograph floating out there in cyberspace, accusing me of being a Nazi. When that's not the case at all. I have friends, and if any of you are familiar with Athens, Ohio, it's pretty blue, democratic, within the city limits and around the campus. But outside the area, in Athens County, it is red, very, very, very conservative. So I have quite a few conservative friends, but they let me hang around. And so one time I got in a conversation with them, and I asked them, why do you dislike Obama? And one responded, well, because I saw a photo of him where he didn't place the correct hand over his heart. And I thought about this, and I go, well, have you heard of something called Photoshop? I mean, even I know how to flip a photograph so it shows opposite. Did you not think that perhaps after all the years he's been, I mean, he went to law school, he worked on a law review, he ran for public office a few times, and he's had a lot of fundraisers and hanging out with politicians and at ball games, that you wouldn't think someone would have told him, hey, Barack, maybe you need to switch your hand when we go out to these fundraising events. But just the, I think, willful ignorance. They already decided that they didn't like him, didn't want to like him, but that was the best this friend of mine could come up with and trying to justify why he didn't like him. And it's called confirmation bias. I'm guilty of it. When we only follow social media sites that has the information we agree with or we like to see. And that creates echo chambers. It becomes an us versus them mentality. Either you are for me or you are against me. And there's no gray areas, there's no middle ground. And as we know, these echo chambers divide us. And if they divide us as American citizens, it weakens our government. It weakens our democracy. And as has always been said, a house divided cannot stand. Also, public distrust is associated with other countries. You've read stories about countries, for example, Russia, that deliberately post false information, not because they necessarily agree with that point of view, but just to cause some problems, just to cause havoc, and get people over here in the United States to disagree with each other, because they're trying to divide our country. And Facebook has been accused of actually where foreign countries have used their social media platform in order to send out disinformation, I'd even call it malinformation, to deliberately be harmful. And it resulted in governments being toppled. So if that can happen in other governments, imagine what could happen here. They use emotion as the weapon of choice so that the enemy is from within, not coming from without. And then when we see a story and we don't check the accuracy of that story, and we start sharing it with friends because we assume it's on the internet, it must be true, that makes the problem even worse. And so one of the things that we can do is when we recognize that it's not the journalist's role, only the journalist's role, to try to solve the problem we're having, but to exercise our own media literacy, check our emotions. Because that's what the disinformation sharers are doing. They're trying to get us to act emotionally. Check our evidence. Fact check. See what other sources sources are saying about this particular topic. If there's only one person or one site saying it, chances are that maybe it might not be true. But check your sources. The original source, when, why, are there any hidden agendas that you think are there? Make sure the sources are credible and that there's evidence that the information is credible by how well you can find similar stories from credible sources that would support that particular position. I learned how to reverse check photos. It's amazing how you see a photo in a news story and you think something really bad happened because they used that photo, but it's a different photo used inappropriately that was taken 10, 15 years ago at another event, but it looked really good, it looked real nice. So they attached that photo to the current story, and then you think the situation is a lot worse than what it actually is. Journalism, we call that just flat out just lying. True journalists, we don't teach that. Students come to visit, prospective students and their parents come to visit, and one time I got accosted, I think, by a parent who accused us, of being responsible for all the fake news that's out there. I go, that's not what we teach our students. Now, we have no control over them once they graduate and what their employers may want, but if they come to the EW Scripps School of Journalism to get a journalism education, we do not teach them to make up stories. We do not teach them to put photos that have nothing to do with the story they covered in there because it's a cute photo. And of course, it brings out more emotion in that photo. Photos can be altered. I already told you my story about Obama and the Nazi salute. The general public have access to technology in which they can make the information they want to share look like a news story. They have the software, the pagination, the designer software. So when you see it, and if you're not paying attention, you think it's a legitimate news story, when actually it's just something that someone made up to try to, again, divide us. So local news is vital to keeping communities informed about the issues that directly affect us. Local news is vital to the survival of our democracy. And it's everyone's responsibility. We need to do what we can to preserve our local news. And by preserving our local news, we help to preserve our democracy, which is the bedrock of our democracy is the First Amendment. And I'd like to end by quoting Abraham Lincoln. We the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men, and I guess the people now, who pervert the Constitution. Thank you very much, and it's my turn to invite Ann Fisher up to continue our discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dassel. Thank you for that good advice and those good recommendations. And now I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to introduce Ann Fisher. I'm not going to do an elaborate discussion because you all know her.
Hi, thank you so much. I was thinking about the social media thing and how that plays a role in all of this with particularly young people that you work with every day. And I was doom scrolling on Twitter today over the Hurricane Ian, and a local journalist in Tampa had posted, Fort Myers had posted a very dramatic photo of the water coming up through a stairwell. And there were requests from all over the world, from news organizations all over the world saying, can we use that? Can we use that footage? Can we use that we need it, we need to know that. And she was just giving it away for free. And I thought, there may come a day, and there will come a day, because local newspapers and other local outlets are at quote unquote an extinction level now. They're going away. I mean, we could talk about it all we want, but this is like, pick your extinct species. That's what we're talking about at this point. So I'm wondering if you talk to students, or if students are being taught about the value of their product and how to manage that going forward into this kind of gig universe. They're doing a lot of gig work now. It's hard to get a job, a regular job, and how they're managing the content that they do produce.
Short answer, yes. But to expand on that, we do teach our students that, because if you remember, it wasn't that long ago that you could read news articles for free on the internet, that you could download them free of charge, and the newspapers quickly realized that they were losing money. And so now, if you want to read a New York Times article, you click on it, but they say you have to purchase a subscription first. So what used to be free on the internet isn't free anymore for that very reason. And so we have news management classes. Our student organizations are very active, and they have guest speakers to come in to tell them what's the best way to protect their copyrighted material as a journalist. And of course, if they're working for a news organization, the news organization will do its own protecting, particularly Associated Press. If you work for Associated Press, you sign, Associated Press owns the copyright to those photographs and to those news stories, not the individual reporter. That might change, but currently that's the case. And so some students learn the hard way when they do a class project and they need a photograph. So they download a photograph because it's out there on the internet, so it must be free because we can download it, and they include it in their assignment for class, which is okay. They can slide with that if they use it in class. But they get in trouble when they post it on their own personal website as part of their portfolio. I've seen several letters from the legal companies that represent the Associated Press. All they do is search the internet all day to find those people who are using Associated Press copyrighted works without subscribing to the Associated Press or buying the license. So yes, we're aware of that.
I started in the business at the Grand Rapids Press, and I was working for their, one of their inserts. So that's how the newspapers, went from the little tiny newspapers. A lot of those got bought up by the likes of the Grand Rapids Press or the Columbus Dispatch or whatever. And like this week, I worked for that department for a while, and I covered, my very first job was covering the Sparta Village Council. And I remember sitting there one night, and I remember, you talk about keeping local officials and stuff accountable. I remember them pointing me out and saying, oh, and the Grand Rapids Press is here. They didn't like it. And I remember they asked me at the end of the meeting, do you have any questions? They were very patronizing and mean, and I was very frightened, and I said, yeah, what's a drain tile? Because they were just talking about drainage tiles all night. And they all started laughing, and it disarmed them, but I was dead serious. But it made me very aware at that point of this, it's come down to that. But there's nobody watching the Sparta Village Council anymore. This is up in Western Michigan, by the way. And I'm wondering, where do young journalists learn the ropes in that way?
Well, we haven't. I only can speak for the School of Journalism at Hawaii University, but we have an internship requirement. Our students are required to do at least one internship before they are awarded their degree. And some students, in the 4 years that they are there, they may do 2 or 3 internships by the time they graduate. And we try to make sure the students we encourage them to take enough coursework, journalism coursework, so, and some of them are getting it already in high school, where they can go to a small newspaper or a small media organization, and they can actually be part of the team. They're not fetching coffee. They're not running the teleprompter like I had to do. But they are actually assigned stories to cover. We have a local, one of two local newspapers in Athens that both are owned by the same company. They're not family owned anymore. And for a while, one of the local papers only had two reporters, and both of those reporters were OU graduates. So they get experience through their internships.
And then I've got interns on my staff, and I finally figured out after telling them for years, it's been where just go to the front page, go to Metro Cover. You know, the show ideas are right there, right in front of you, and they kind of nod. And it finally occurred to me a few years ago, they don't know what a front page is anymore. And they're not all, by the way, not all my interns are journalism students. And I finally started having just quick, meetings with each one of them to show them how to find the front page on the digital, to find the digital version of the paper. Because they're just used to having whatever pops up, and I explained algorithms to them, and the things that are popping up for you are not the same things that are popping up for me. Here's where you have to go to find it. They're kind of like, whoa. I mean, they are really astounded, and I'm wondering, I'm sure journalism, we studied this in J school, right? You take a class on editing, and they teach you how to lay out a paper, and they teach you why, what's on the top right, what's on the lower left, blah, blah, blah. It's a science. But there's so many other people graduating from college nowadays that don't even know what a front page is. And I'm wondering, have you thought about some kind of extension service of the journalism school to reach out to other disciplines and prepare these people to how to consume news?
We do have a class called News and Information Literacy, so we do teach media literacy as a course. It's an elective course, which means students can take it if they want to, but they don't have to take it. And so the next step is convincing the university that it is a type of course that all students at the university should take, not just students in the School of Journalism. And that goes back to my point about the need for media literacy. It isn't so much the journalist, of course, the students need some training too, but it's everybody who consumes social media. I'll ask this semester, I have 150 first-year students in the class, and I ask them where do they get their news. Well, first of all, their definition of news is not the same as my definition of news. And they'll say, well, I get all my news from social media. And then I'll ask them what sites they're following, and it's, somebody's graduation party, whatever the latest challenge is on TikTok. But it's not the type of journalism or local news that I think they should follow to be good journalists. They just think news is news. It's anything that you're interested in, and they haven't. And I'm trying to get them to understand that the lines that were clearer before the internet, lines separating traditional journalism from entertainment and from junk, those lines are blurring and they're all together. And some of the students, they talk about news and they try to be all sophisticated, but it's not the news content that I would consider that you would need to follow to be a good journalist. They slip into their favorite social media sites. There was a time we had maybe 1-2 newspapers, an AM station, an FM station, maybe if we were large enough, at least a couple of local television stations, where we all had access. We were able to talk about the same types of stories, generally speaking, when we get together. that doesn't happen anymore, because there's so many different apps and outlets, and as you said, what pops up on my screen is completely different than what may pop up on a younger person's screen, and I wear my boomer title with pride.
When I grew up, everyone had Sports Illustrated, Time Magazine, Newsweek Magazine, Life Magazine, maybe American Heritage if you were into that kind of stuff like my dad was, and then the local newspaper and whatnot.
And if you woke up, if you were school age, and you woke up and it was snowing and you wanted to know whether or not there was school that day, we all listened to the same television stations or radio stations. We knew that someone was going to call those stations with that information. But I'm sure now they have highly sophisticated ways. They have phone trees. When my godsons were small, I used to get those phone calls that it's not really necessary to call me. There aren't any classes, today because of the snow. But if people are pulled in so many different directions that they're not as knowledgeable as they should be. But they define news as entertainment, what an actor's doing or what an artist is doing, and they think that's news. They consider, now sports, I consider sports news to a certain extent, but some students, they're only interested in doing play-by-play or going to the games or following a particular team. So it takes some education, which is why they're there. If they already knew it, then
I know we have to cut it off, but that kind of reminds me of the whole sports thing. I thought of that today too. That young journalists grow up covering high school football and high school basketball. That's how they get their start. Young journalists start at the Sparta Village Council and learn what a drain tile is and all that kind of prosaic crap that you kind of do to build up a resume and build up a basis, some knowledge about how public affairs work and how sports works and that kind of a thing. And I just wonder if it's just an internship here and that instead of a 2-year commitment I made to the Sparta Village Council. Blah. But I learned a lot doing that. And I think about sports writers, everything. They're just kind of jumping in at a different level than a lot of us came up through. Like you.
Well, again, I can only speak for the School of Journalism at Ohio University, but our school, which will be celebrating its centennial in January, I'd like to say that we've supported experiential learning since 1923, so it's not just the internships, it's the curriculum that they're getting. They get hands-on practice doing the craft. Faculty members who all have professional experience, they have assignments in which they're actually doing the craft. I talked about the 2 local stations, but they do have a competitor, and that's the Post, Ohio University's editorially independent student newspaper, and they have done wonderful work on a daily basis. They're devoted to covering the local news there. They have advanced with the internet. They have 1 print edition a week, but they have the website that's updated all the time. They've broken several stories, local stories, that weren't really being covered in the local area, so they're getting a lot of information. There's WOUB, the public broadcast station at Ohio University, and they use a lot of student talent for anchors and reporters, particularly in sports. They have several sports student-produced programs that have won local Emmys. And I'd like to take a little bit of credit for a program called Gridiron Glory, because when I was teaching TV newscast course, they were getting grades in this as part of their curriculum, and we'd have a critique after the newscast. I'd say then the only sports they were covering would be professional sports, the Bengals, or baseball, but the professional sports or college sports, that was it. And I just happened to mention casually, I go, well, I don't really follow sports that well, but I do know you're probably going to get a job in a smaller market. And so when you go home and you watch your local stations, what kind of sports do you see? And they're talking high school basketball and high school football. I go, you know, they have high schools here. You know, and so one student in that class actually listened to me that day and came up with the idea for Gridiron Glory. So it's been 15, 20 years ago, and since that time, they have unions, and they, like I said, they win local Emmys. But what I like about our program is that there's so many opportunities to get experiential learning so they can get their most of their mistakes out of the way and learn before they enter the job market.
So EW Scripps School of Journalism, it's one of the best in the country, and it's been a privilege speaking with you tonight, Edith. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I actually do have one question for you. I understand that there's been a lot of research that says there's a correlation between lack of a local newspaper and newspaper reporting and higher taxes in those communities. Because nobody is watching the city council and the city manager and asking about drain tiles. So I did want to give you a chance to comment on that.
Well, I'm familiar with some of those stories, and it alluded to that sometimes the crime rate increases if you don't have quality local journalism. But it sounds perfectly logical to me. I mean, if you don't have transparency in the government and these elected officials are getting away with doing whatever they want to do and passing whatever law they want to pass, and there isn't anyone to hold them accountable, then of course taxes, go up. And so that sounds perfectly logical to me.
I would only add to that I'm not sure that public officials writ large are always even aware of that. I don't think they're nefariously thinking, hey, there's nobody covering us, so let's jack up the taxes. I think they actually think people don't care, or they must not care, or they must approve, because there isn't any feedback on it. It's because they don't know what's going on.
I would agree with you on that. It's a combination of ignorance and not paying attention and other reasons as well. But again, I'd like to thank Dr. Dassel and Ann Fisher. Thank you so much. And thank you all so very much for coming. And we'll maybe see you at our holiday party in December. Thank you all.